Okay, so I just want to end this video series with a short slideshow explaining some of the terminology and some of the structure behind the way a Visual Studio application is built and created. So, we talked about object-oriented programming, and I want you to start thinking about everything as an object. The form is an object. The button on the form is an object. We haven't looked at a text box yet, but we're going to have a text box in our next lesson. The label, and so on. Okay, the picture box, we looked at one of those. So these are like kind of ready-made objects that come with the Visual Studio. Later in the semester, we're going to do our own objects. We're going to create our own objects like student objects and books and employees, and those are called business objects that we as developers can define and use in our programs. But we're not quite there yet. That's coming much later in the semester. For now, I just want you to kind of get in that mode of thinking of everything as an object. And, we already talked about objects having properties and methods. The properties are attributes of an object or characteristics of the object, such as the form's back color or the label's text property. And then methods are capabilities that an object can do. Actions that the object can perform. Like, this.close is the form's close method. We haven't looked at a lot of methods, but we're going to be using them all the time. Okay, think of, the methods are verbs, they're action words. Okay, so all objects start with a class. This is not something that came up with in the previous videos, but when you drop a button from the toolbox onto your form, that doesn't happen like magic, okay? It happens because somebody from Microsoft wrote the code to represent that button, and then we can come along and just plop it on the form and not think anything of it because the hard work is already done. It was done by somebody before us, and that person wrote a button class or coded a button class. A class is a code with file in it, or is a file with code in it, I should say, that describes an object, okay? So it's like a car on the street, or maybe you're going to go shopping for a brand new car. That car did not appear out of thin air. An engineer sat down with a program and designed all the specifications for that car, okay? So that's like the equivalent, the real world equivalent of a class. Or you can think of even like plans for a house. The house doesn't just go up in the subdivision willy-nilly, okay? Somebody puts some detailed plans in place. So that's like what a class is, but it's within the context of the programming environment. It's the design for the thing, the design for the object that is behind the scenes. So when you install the Visual Studio at home, you are installing not only the software that you're using to create your programs, but this huge library called the Framework Class Library, this huge library of code files that has that's the class files for all these things that you might want to use, the buttons, the text boxes, the forms, everything you can imagine. And I mean, we're only going to use a very small part of what's available. So that's really what we call the Framework Class Library. It's this, huge library with all these goodies in it that we can use very easily to create these, really nice functional programs without a lot of code. We barely wrote any code in the previous videos. Okay, so we talked about the fact that we're doing event-driven programming. And an event typically occurs when the user engages with your interface in some way, typically clicking a button. But, the user does not necessarily have to be involved, and we'll look at other events where the user is more passive. But for the most part, the button click is probably going to be our most common event. And just talking a little bit more about the Visual Studio. Okay, really the two main components, the IDE or the Integrated Development Environment, that was the interface, like with the Solution Explorer, the Properties window, the form design, the toolbox. That was the user interface that we were using to create our application, the code window, the whole thing that we were looking at in the previous videos. And then behind the scenes, what you don't see is the .NET framework, okay? And that includes this framework class library that I talked about, the huge library of code files, as well as all kinds of, it's really like, you know, the whole like workhorse behind the scenes. You have the part you can see, the IDE that you're working with, but then everything else that you don't even have to think about is being handled behind the scenes by the .NET, through the .NET framework. Security for your application that you typically don't have to think about. All the memory management. We didn't really use variables. We didn't create our own variables, but all those objects are loaded into memory when the program runs. All that memory management is handled behind the scenes by the .NET framework. We don't have to think anything of it. So yeah, the .NET framework is really an important part of the Visual Studio. And it also includes the Common Language Runtime, which I'll talk about in a moment. Here's like kind of a visual, if you can imagine the .NET framework. Let's say this is you working on a homework assignment, okay? You're using all these goodies from the library, the framework class library, incorporating them into your application. And then when you hit that Run button, that code is compiled to like kind of a common, just kind of like a common language, non-specific language, and it runs in the Common Language Runtime, which is a part of the .NET framework. So it's kind of like reduced down to this common denominator type language, which is really, and we're not going to do this in our class, but you could conceivably use a C# application, but also add, say, a C++ code file to it, because they're all like kind of boiled down to this non-specific language, which runs in the Common Language Runtime. Again, we call this language interoperability. It's not something we would be taking advantage of at all in this class, but it's a capability of the .NET framework because it's such sophisticated software. So, and security is also handled by the .NET framework, I said. So really everything that you don't see is being handled by the .NET framework. It's a very sophisticated software. Okay, and then the whole thing about namespaces, this is not something I pointed out, but you'll see at the top of every code file that you start, you're going to have these using statements, okay? And these are namespaces. We talked about the library, this framework class library, this very vast library of objects. And libraries are organized, just like a library on the street. They don't just throw all the books on the shelf disorganized, okay? They're organized in a very specific way. And in the framework class library, they use namespaces to organize classes or objects in the library. So, for example, like in an actual library, if you say you're looking for an Agatha Christie novel, and they say, okay, go to the fiction section, and then within the fiction section, there's a mystery shelf, and then within the mystery shelf, there's a special shelf for the armchair cozies, which is the type of mystery that you want, and then on that shelf, you'll see Agatha Christie. Okay, so it's a very specific chain of organization that you would have to follow to get to that book. And so in the framework class library, we use that same type of organization. Okay, there's a namespace called system. Within that namespace, there's a namespace called Windows. Within that namespace, there's a namespace called forms. And then finally, you'll get to the text box that you're looking for, or the label that you're looking for. So you'll see these using statements at the top of your code file. That's what they're talking about. They're saying, okay, there's stuff in all these namespaces that we want to use typically, and that's why they're included by default at the top of a form class, a form file. So it's saying, okay, you're probably going to want to use what's in these namespaces, so we're going to include these namespaces at the top of your form. So you generally don't have to touch those. Eventually, we're going to get to some different files where we're going to be adding our own using statements at the top, but for the most part, just leave these alone. But that's what this is about. It's about navigating that huge, vast framework class library. Okay, so I think that's enough for this unit, and you have enough now to get started on your own little homework assignment.